Hillbrook Insane Asylum Patient File Update. Entry by Dr. Quentin Quatermain. Patient number 149, Arnim Tamzarian, aka the Principal. Just named him after his occupation. I would call that lazy, but that would imply in some way encodes the nicknaming trend. Anyway, over our last few sessions, the patient has shown signs of minor improvements. Nothing warranting release yet. However, I do believe we're past the point of him being considered a threat, if he ever truly was one to begin with. He has come to terms with what he has done, even shows great remorse for it, but the delusion still holds. He is yet to accept the truth, to wake up to reality. It's a bit of a tricky situation, in that he has acknowledged the crime, only to then incorporate it into his narrative, in some ways strengthening it, and making it easier for him to fall into. Regardless, the hope is that we can use this breakthrough as a line of sorts to pull him out, focus on it as a point of genuine reality, and slowly dismantle the surrounding delusion. Rushing things now would only bring the patient frustration and likely cause him to slip deeper into old behaviour. I am also sad to report that he is still unresponsive to his real name. He's never aggravated, just dismissive of it. The name Arnim Tamzarian is nothing to him, just shrugs and moves along whenever he hears it. This is unfortunate, for I feel if he were to accept his old identity, his real identity, it might spare him some of the pain. Or worsen it, depends how sympathetic he is, I suppose. Tamzarian once knew all too well who he was, what he was. Nothing. A piece of societal garbage left in the gutter to die by a world that didn't care. And he was fine with that. If anything, it justified how very little care he showed in return. Orphaned at age 9, dropped out of school at age 16, burned through multiple small-time jobs before falling into petty crime, mostly smash and grabs, had a particular fondness for purse snatching. It was far from stable living, but it was enough to get by, which was enough for him. Living life on the edge leaves very little time to get contemplative about it. Such a thing wouldn't come about until he was arrested, and a judge forced the matter. Tamzarian had a choice. Prison, the army, or apologise to the old lady he had robbed. Probably would have chosen the latter had he had known the Vietnam War was still going on at the time. Wait, Vietnam War? How old is this guy? Ironically, it was here, in an environment where he spent every waking moment on the cusp of death, where he found a reason to live. His commanding officer, Sergeant Seymour Skinner, saw potential in the young man, in spite of his pessimistic attitude. Taking him under his wing, he instructed him on not just how to fight, but why to fight. War is the ultimate failure in diplomacy. It is never a positive thing, but it certainly makes one appreciate those that are. To dream of a better tomorrow and strive to make it a reality. For Skinner, that dream was to become the principal at his hometown's elementary school, to help nurture the development of up-and-coming youngsters, to be a positive influence in their lives. Tamzarian thought it was corny, but at the same time, it was hopeful, inspiring. It was something to live for, what Tamzarian had lacked all this time. In a way, Skinner's dream became his dream, which made it all the more devastating when it all came crashing down. Their platoon was making an assault on an enemy stronghold. Without warning, they came under fire from a surprise napalm strike. Skinner had been leading from the front, Tamzarian and the rest less than 10 feet behind him. The explosions lit up the battlefield, momentarily blinding them all. And when their sight returned, he was nowhere to be seen. After the battle were calmed, an extensive search was done, but no trace of the sergeant was ever found. Just like that, all the hope and optimism that had entered Tamzarian's life was gone. His future, once again, nothing but an empty void. It was perhaps this lack of a strong identity of his own that served as the catalyst for what was to come. Working alongside Skinner, the older brother he had never had, that had been his life. Brief as their time together was, it was more worthwhile than anything he had had before. It was all he had, and he clung to it to the very end. Upon returning to America, he had insisted on being the one to break the news to Skinner's mother, Agnes. It would be the last meaningful thing he could do before falling back into the nothing he'd been before. Which made it all the harder to do when he reached that doorstep. When the old lady answered the door and stood before him, he stumbled over his words for what felt like an eternity. He just couldn't accept it was about to end, wishing that something, anything would allow him to hang on to this life just a little longer. Well, as it would happen, he got his wish. Agnes had not seen her boy in years. She had been waiting day after day for him to come home, a desperate longing not too different from Armin's. So when she saw this strapping young soldier standing before her, she didn't see Armin. She saw Seymour. It was a moment of senility, one that could have likely been cleared up with a simple explanation. But Tamzarian didn't provide one. In that moment, he realized, no, it didn't have to end here. Skinner's dream could live on, through him. So when Agnes asked if it was him, Tamzarian reassured her that yes, her son was home. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe he simply didn't have it in him to tell the truth. But whatever reasoning he put behind it soon no longer mattered. He was willing to fill the void left by Skinner, and Agnes was more than happy to have him do so. This is what we call a folie à deux, a shared delusion. Perhaps on some level, both parties were aware it was all a lie, but living that lie was far more appealing than facing the truth. They weren't hurting anyone by doing so, nobody else was there to object, so what reason did they have not to? And in fairness to Tamzarian, he did commit. He cared for Agnes's health, got a teaching degree, landed that principal position at the elementary school. He ended up doing a lot of good. All under the name of Seymour Skinner, of course. Which was ultimately the problem. See, lying is a skill. You have to inflect, loosen up, make proper eye contact. It takes real talent to do it convincingly. And in that regard, Tamzarian was a master. It was easy for him to forget about his old life. There was so little to it after all. It was nothing compared to Skinner's. Of that, he studied all he could. Every diary and log Seymour had ever kept, his personal information, all helpfully provided by Agnes, of course. Couldn't allow her boy to get confused. And with how private of a man Skinner had been before enlisting, he had little in the way of friends who could step in and muddle things up. Truly a prime candidate for identity theft. Nearly 3 decades later, Tamzarian had doctored every photo, altered every document. For all intents and purposes, he was Seymour Skinner. He had been Seymour Skinner for more people than the real one had been. And it was that revelation, the day he began to comprehend just how far that original lie had been stretched, that he began to worry. After all, this life of his, as fulfilling as it was, had still been built on false pretenses. And those don't make for a stable foundation. If anyone found out the truth, that would be it. It would all come tumbling down. He couldn't allow that to happen, no matter the cost, no matter how many additional lies he had to pile on top to maintain the original. And it was through this that, for Tamzarian, lying stopped being just second nature, stopped being a necessity. It became a compulsion. It stopped being a fear of this one truth and became a revulsion towards truth in general, as if the mere act of being honest was somehow a risk to his identity. This brought on a trend of him weaving longer, more convoluted tales, embellishing his, or rather Skinner's, war record, leading to multiple contradictory recollections of events. At points, he'd only lost a couple of his men, both during a firefight. Other times, he lost his entire platoon during a period they were captured by the Viet Cong, the length of which varied massively between retellings. It also began to affect his career, his social life. He would lie about the school's budget and test scores, both of which were in an appalling state. He found difficulty being honest with his partners, resulting in an inability to hold down a relationship for very long. Even his dedication to continuing Skinner's legacy, that began to suffer as well. The Seymour Skinner he had been portraying this whole time began to devolve from the authoritative, stern, inspiring figure he had looked up to, into this awkward, inept fool. Even Agnes began finding him aggravating, her pride in her son having long since dried up, in spite of all he continued to do for her. It all came to a head one day when Tamzarian, in an attempt to smooth things over with the school board, invited his superintendent, one Mr. Gary Chalmers, over to his house, or rather Agnes's house, since she still lived there, for what he claimed would be an unforgettable luncheon. Oh, how right he proved to be. Things didn't get off to a great start. Tamzarian's compulsive lying had led to him giving Chalmers some less than helpful directions, but ultimately he made it. Leaving the superintendent to make himself at home, Tamzarian went into the kitchen to check on the roast he had left cooking in the oven. Unfortunately, it seemed his cooking ability was about on par with his skills as a principal, for in his brief absence, it had overcooked and was currently on fire. The meal was ruined, and so would be the luncheon if Tamzarian didn't think of something fast. He couldn't let this go downhill. Skinner would have never let that happen. Would he? He wasn't sure. No. He wouldn't. He'd have never let the roast burn in the first place. He couldn't admit to this mistake. He'd have to cover it up, find a replacement. And as luck would have it, one was handily provided just outside. There was a fast food restaurant over the road from him. He could simply slip out, purchase a meal, and disguise it as his own cooking. A delightfully devilish solution. He'd only gotten one leg out through the window, however, when Chalmers, curious about what was taking him so long, walked in. Caught, Tamzarian had to come up with some kind of explanation, the one he settled on being exercise. Yes, he was just stretching his calves on the windowsill for a bit of isometric exercise. Yes, perfectly logical. And sadly quite pointless, as Chalmers hadn't even been looking his way, his attention instead drawn to the oven. The oven that Tamzarian, in his haste to get away, had forgotten to switch off, and was now billowing smoke. But he quickly hand-waved that as well, saying it wasn't smoke, but steam. Steam from these steamed clams they were having. Yes, steamed clams. While an awkward pause between the two did follow this, Chalmers nonetheless shrugged it off and headed back into the dining room. Even though he was off the hook, this left Tamzarian in a dilemma. He could see the smoke growing thicker, the flames inside burning brighter and stronger all the while. Now all he had to do was turn off the oven, a simple action. But then, if there was no smoke, or steam, that would imply that they weren't having steamed clams, and he couldn't risk that, now could he? No. So he let it be, leaving it on as he vaulted out the window and ran across the street. Now, since moving to America, I've come to learn that the fast food industry over here is surprisingly robust. A lot more variety than you might expect. Yet even so, I'm pretty confident you will be hard-pressed to find an establishment that will serve you up steamed clams in a hurry. Thankfully, the trip to the burger joint and back gave Tamzarian plenty of time to construct the further narrative in advance, taking into account the many questions Chalmers was likely to have. The first of which was, naturally, why on earth he was walking in with a steaming hot plate of hamburgers. He thought they were having steamed clams. But Tamzarian was insistent. He had misheard him. He had said they were having steamed hams. That's what he called hamburgers. Said it was a regional dialect, the kind they use in upstate New York. This was around the time that Chalmers first truly became suspicious. After all, he was from Utica, and he'd never heard anyone use the phrase steamed hams before, even if Skinner here insisted it was an Albany expression. He'd known this man for years by now. He was well aware of his little eccentricities. But this was the first time they'd been together outside of a workplace setting, completely free of distraction. And it was here that he began to notice how Skinner didn't quite seem alright. The way his eyes would stare unshakingly, that way too wide smile of his. He emanated this vibe that just really didn't sit right with him, almost scared him in a way. So, Chalmers decided to push a little deeper, see if it was just his imagination. This was the guy running his school after all, he had to be sure he could trust him. Giving one of the hamburgers a closer look, Chalmers commented on how they were quite similar to the ones they served at Krusty Burger, the very restaurant Tamzarian had got them from, which of course he denied. Patented Skinner burgers, they were old family recipe. Only made sense to give them a funny nickname like steamed hams. And that's when Chalmers caught him. He called them steamed hams, yet opening them up, he revealed that they weren't steamed at all. They were grilled. Tamzarian's blood ran cold. He'd been backed into a corner, stammering and stuttering as he tried in vain to think of something to say in response. But he couldn't. He'd played all his cards already. And all the while, the silence between him and his increasingly unnerved guest lingered, causing him to sweat all the harder. He needed a moment to collect himself, re-establish his story. So he excused himself, rushing back into the kitchen. Whereupon he discovered that his overheated state may not have all been completely due to his nerves acting up. The fire had spread. Last he checked, it had still been contained to the oven, but by now the whole kitchen was engulfed in flame. Rate it was spreading, would be long till it took the whole house down. Natural survival instincts kicked in. Tamzarian had to get this blaze under control. He had to get everyone out of the house. Without hesitation, he burst back into the dining room, looked Chalmers straight in the eye, and told him that he had a good time, but he was feeling tired. Probably best to end their get-together there. Couldn't do it. Even in mortal danger, even when he was trying to, he couldn't tell the truth. It was like trying to not scratch an itch. You know it's developing into a rash, but you can't help yourself. Thankfully, by this point, Chalmers had been looking for an excuse to get away. Didn't take much more convincing than that. Yet as he got up to leave, he just caught sight of the bright light emanating from beyond the kitchen door. Shocked, he couldn't help but ask just what was happening in there. And without so much as a flinch, Tamzarian answered, "Aurora Borealis." It took a good few moments of stunned silence for Chalmers to process what he'd just said. And to his credit, what was he supposed to say to that? Aurora Borealis! At that time of year, at that time of day, in that part of the country, localized entirely within his kitchen. All to which Tamzarian just simply reaffirmed, yes. The sheer absurdity of it, the complete lack of even so much as a fraction of a logical basis. And yet, with the look he gave as he said it, that gaze of absolute certainty, that he truly believed what he had just told him, all Chalmers could think to say in response was, could he see it? To which Tamzarian rather wisely said no. Less than a minute later, he'd walked Chalmers out the front door. Just in time too, as he could already hear the flames crackling behind him. Above it all, however, he soon heard something else coming from upstairs. The all too familiar shrill voice of Agnes Skinner shrieking to her son that the house was on fire. Oh yes, Mother was still home, wasn't she? Not missing a beat, Tamzarian turned and called out to her, "No, Mother, it's just the Northern Lights." The truth must never come out, no matter the cost. It had certainly evaded Chalmers. He had felt uneasy about him, found him to be an odd fellow, but in the end, he hadn't done anything explicitly wrong as far as he could tell, and he had to admit, he did seem a good ham. So the two parted ways on good terms, Tamzarian smiling and waving the superintendent off, while doing all he could to ignore the desperate cries of the old lady, choking to death one floor up. Wasn't long before the fire department was on the scene. One of the neighbours had spotted the smoke early on and made the call. A truck was there in moments, though sadly it still proved too late to save Agnes. Tamzarian, having gone back inside, suffered some burns, but nothing too major. He was charged with manslaughter, which naturally he pleaded innocent to. However, it wasn't long into the trial, around the time he had made his third change of plea, that they realised what was up. Probably would have been eligible for a more low-risk facility, but as the investigation showed the sheer scale of Tamzarian's lies, on top of the fact he was willing to let someone he cared about die in the name of maintaining them, they were concerned that someone of such a high-functioning delusional state, with that amount of disregard for life, could have been a danger in a more casual environment, so to Hillbrook he went. Number 149 is far from my only patient with an extreme case of identity disorder. See patient file number 921 for further reference. However, this isn't so much a case of losing one's own identity as it is denying it. Tamzarian has no interest in being himself, only Skinner. Skinner was his life. In spite of him inadvertently smearing the man's legacy beyond recognition, he still clings to it because he believes that, even in this state, it is still more worthwhile than his own. And of all the lies he's told, and believe me, there are many, that may well be the biggest one of them all. We all have great potential within us, it's just a matter of finding it. And the only way we can do that is if we are true to ourselves. And that's what I keep trying to get him to realise. It may sound just as corny as Sergeant Skinner's talk of hopes and dreams, but the fact is that the truth is always better than a well-meant lie. Makes one wonder what a better place the world might be if we were all capable of that. Intrinsic to our society as it may have unfortunately have become, if no one was ever to lie, if we could all manage to be truthful to each other, we would be free of so much. Deceit, betrayal, manipulation, a lot of crime, distrust, and definitely disappointment. We would never again have to suffer the anguish of getting all excited over something, only for it to turn out to be not what we were hoping for. I think we could all do without that. Still, it's not like I'm being all that truthful right now myself. After all, I'm not really here, am I? This is all just some dream I'm having to help me distract myself from the fact I'm really in a holding cell on charges of kidnapping in what is an obvious ploy by Fitzroy to derail my mayoral campaign. Speaking of which, I should probably wake up and get back to sorting that out. End recording, I guess, whatever this is. I'm not sure anymore. Skinner with his crazy explanations. The superintendent's gonna need his medication. When he hears Skinner's lame exaggerations, there'll be trouble in town tonight.